They told you the Salem Witch Trials ended in 1693. They lied. The hangings, the panic, the whispers. They want you to think it all burned out with the last gallows rope. But what if I told you it never stopped? What if the story you know, the pious Puritans, the false accusations, the fragile hysteria, was just the first act? Because almost 2 centuries later, when America was supposed to be enlightened and industrialized, something woke up, something old, something hungry. And the question is, why? Why in the age of steam engines and telegraphs did whispers of witchcraft rise again in the same cursed soil of Massachusetts? Not the history book's version, not the sanitized tale of superstition lingering in rural towns. No, this was deliberate, organized, powerful men and women pulling strings in shadows. While the newspapers wrote about progress and industry, by the late 1800s, Salem wasn't a backwater. It was a hub of money and influence. But behind the marble bank walls and Victorian parlors, a different kind of council was meeting, a society not of faith, but of inversion. They didn't wear black hats. They wore silk gloves. They didn't chant in Latin. They recited oaths in the language of power, and their rituals weren't for salvation. They were for control. And here's the part no one tells you. It worked, because every panic, every witch scare, every whisper of diabolical influence is never random. It's a tool, a weapon used to break a community, to erase resistance, to rewire belief. And in Salem by 1878, that weapon was unsheathed again. Only this time, it wasn't to kill the poor or the powerless. It was to build an empire. This isn't about witches in the woods. It's about men who learned the oldest truth. If you can control what people fear, you can control everything. And tonight, I'm going to take you into that empire. Not the tourist Salem, not the postcard Salem. The real one. The one still pulsing way. The echo of secret fires. The one where witchcraft was never about magic, but about domination. And when you see what they built, what they left behind, you'll realize something terrifying. The trials didn't end. They evolved. If you want to understand what happened in Salem in the late 1800s, you have to start with the silence, because history doesn't erase itself. It's erased on purpose, by people who have everything to gain when you forget. After 1693, after the hangings and the confessions and the gallows, the world believed the witch panic was over. But the truth, the real truth, was that the trials created something far more dangerous than fear. They created an idea, a blueprint for control, and the men who understood that didn't burn their notes. They studied them. They perfected them. The original trials were chaos. Too many voices, too much chance. But what if? What if hysteria could be engineered, designed, directed like a weapon? Aim it at an enemy, and you can destroy him without a sword, without a gun, just words and terror. That idea didn't die. It survived. It traveled in whispers through secret societies, fraternal orders, occult revival circles spreading through America in the 19th century. Because something was happening in those years, something that made the soil fertile for hidden power. Industrial wealth was rising. Old families were building dynasties, and with money came hunger for more than land, more than factories. They wanted belief itself. They wanted control of the human mind. And that's why, when spiritualism swept across America, when seances filled drawing rooms, when mediums claimed to speak to the dead, Salem didn't laugh. Salem didn't forget. It adapted. By the 1870s, witchcraft wasn't a crime. It was a fascination. And in that fascination, a door opened. a door for something older than Puritan law, older than the church, older than this nation itself. And when that door opened, the people who stepped through weren't farmers or outcasts. They were the elite, and what they built in Salem wasn't superstition. It was a system of fear and power that still works to this day. It began quietly, no mobs, no gallows, just a girl and a whisper. February 1878. A small farmhouse in Ipswich, not far from Salem. A teenage servant girl named Lulu falls sick. At first it looks like a fever, but then something changes. She convulses in her bed, her eyes roll back, and she begins to speak in a voice that is not her own. The family calls a doctor, but the doctor calls a priest. And before long, the neighbors are standing outside the windows, listening to Lulu scream that the devil is in the room. The newspapers love it. They call it a case of possession. Some even whisper witchcraft. And suddenly, after almost 200 years, the word witch is on everyone's lips again. But here's what the papers never told you. That same month, not far from Ipswich, a private gathering takes place in Salem, behind closed doors. Inside the home of a prominent businessman, a séance is held, not for comfort, not for curiosity, but for power. They call it a circle. And in that circle sit men whose names you would know. Judges, politicians, bankers, men who shape policy, men who own the railroads and the newspapers that told you the story of Lulu, the servant girl. They are not praying. They are not begging spirits for mercy. They are testing, conducting experiments in belief, in fear, in control. Because hysteria is currency, and the people who know how to spend it will never be poor. Weeks after Lulu's fits make headlines, 3 more possessions occur. Not in farmhouses, but in boarding schools. And every time, the rumors spread faster, the fear deepens, and the circle meets again, quietly, patiently, watching the results like scientists recording data. Because this isn't a haunting, this is a rehearsal. And the stage is Salem. The newspapers called them séances. Harmless parlor tricks, the fashionable amusement of the upper class. They weren't harmless, they weren't tricks. They were laboratories. And the women who sat in the dark, eyes closed, hands on the table, were not fortune tellers. They were instruments, tools in the hands of men who understood one thing better than anyone else: faith. Faith is power, and power can be engineered. The circles that met in Salem were not random. They weren't lonely widows speaking to the dead. They were cells. Branches of something much older, something that crossed oceans and wore a dozen names. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Hermetic Brotherhood, and a newer, more dangerous current, the Theosophical Society. All converging in secret, all feeding on the same idea, that the mind is a gate, and whoever controls the gatekeeper controls the world. These weren't witches in the old sense. No one was flying on broomsticks. This was witchcraft rewritten in the language of modernity, blending ritual with psychology, symbols with science, seances with suggestion. And here's what made it so perfect. In the late 1800s, America was changing. Factories were rising. Cities were swallowing farmland. Old religions were cracking under the weight of progress. People were desperate for meaning, and in that hunger, the elite saw opportunity. Give the masses something to fear, and you can make them beg for your protection. Give them something to worship, and you can lead them anywhere. And Salem, the name already burned into America's imagination, was the perfect theater for the first act of a new drama, not of superstition, but of social engineering. They didn't want to summon demons. They wanted to summon obedience. And they succeeded, because within a decade, The whispers became headlines, and the headlines became panic. And from that panic came the most dangerous spell of all, the illusion of choice. Salem, 1880. The town that once hung witches now hides them in parlors lined with velvet curtains. Not the witches you imagine. No cauldrons, no pointed hats. Only men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns, whispering in candlelight. One of those parlors belonged to a man named Charles Wentworth, a banker, a philanthropist, a name spoken with respect in every corridor of power, from Boston to Washington. But Wentworth had another name, a name used only in the circle. He was called Magister. On a winter night, 9 people gather in his parlor, the air heavy with incense, a black mirror resting on the mantel, a table set with silver bowls filled with salt and wine, and in the center, a book bound in crimson leather. The book isn't ancient. It was printed in London only 10 years before. But its pages carry something older than English. Symbols traced from grimoires burned centuries ago, brought back under a new name. Magnetism, mesmerism, occult science. They believed the mind could be broken like a horse, trained like an animal, through repetition, through ritual, through terror. That night, a woman is led into the circle. She is blindfolded, she kneels, and she is told to speak the names of the old ones, not demons, not saints, but abstractions, power, dominion, will. The men watch. They do not laugh. They do not doubt, because this is not theater for them. This is a contract. When she finishes, they cut a lock of her hair, place it in the crimson book, and close it with a clasp of brass. From that night forward, she is theirs, body, voice, and most of all, mind. This was not an isolated ritual. It was a template, a model, copied in Boston, in New York, in every city where men desired not wealth, but dominion over belief itself. And as they refined their methods, something darker was born. Something the newspapers would one day call a hysteria. But what it really was an experiment. An experiment in mass control. By the 1880s, science was the new scripture, doctors were the new priests, and laboratories were the new cathedrals. The circles understood this. They understood that faith was shifting, that the public no longer feared witches and devils. They feared disease. They worshipped progress. They trusted men in white coats, so the circles adapted. They shed their candles for instruments, their charms for charts, their invocations for experiments. But the goal was the same: control the mind, shape the soul by any means necessary. In Boston, a physician named Dr. William James began studying trance states. Hypnosis, what he called altered consciousness. He wrote about suggestion, about the power of belief to bend reality. And his work was hailed as genius. What the papers never said was that James attended more seances than sermons, that his research subjects were the same mediums sitting in the dark with Salem's elite, and that his notes on suggestion would become weapons in the hands of men who saw people not as citizens, but as clay. From those experiments came a revelation. You don't need ropes and racks to break a mind. You just need repetition, isolation, symbols charged with meaning, and a voice that never stops speaking. The circles devoured this knowledge. They blended it with their old rituals. They called it psychological science. But make no mistake, it was witchcraft wearing a lab coat. By the 1890s, hospitals began adopting these methods, quietly, under the name of treatment. Patients were hypnotized, conditioned, reprogrammed, and the doctors, the respected men of science, reported their success in journals, read by every university in the nation. But behind closed doors, Another kind of report circulated. Private letters. Describing the potential of these methods. Not for healing, but for ruling, letters that spoke of a future where entire populations could be guided, controlled, by fear, by faith, by forces they could not name, and that future started in Salem. The first spark didn't look like a conspiracy. It looked like a sickness. Winter of 1890, Danvers, Massachusetts, once known as Salem Village, the birthplace of the original trials. A schoolteacher, respected, pious, suddenly collapses in the classroom. She shakes, she screams, she claims to see faces in the walls, hands reaching for her throat. The town doctor calls it hysteria. The newspapers call it a return of the Salem curse. And the story spreads like fire. Within a month, 5 more women suffer the same affliction, all of them young, all of them living within 10 miles of Salem. Convulsions, visions, uncontrollable screams in the night. The press feasts on it. Editorials ask if the old spirits have returned. Tourists begin to arrive. And under the noise of curiosity, under the laughter of skeptics, the real work begins. Because these episodes are not accidents, they are patterns. Every afflicted woman had attended the same lecture series at the same hall in Salem, a series on mental science, taught by a man who belonged to the circle. Coincidence? No. Experiment. They wanted to see if the mind could be broken from a distance, through suggestion, through the seed of an idea planted like a curse. And it worked. Letters between members describe the results in clinical detail. The teacher in Danvers was the first. She was chosen because of her influence, because her collapse would ripple through the community, and it did. Within weeks, the panic grew. Churches preached against the devil. Parents kept children home from school. And the name Salem, once buried in history, rose from the grave. But here's the most chilling part. The panic was never meant to stay local. It was a test, a rehearsal for something larger, a blueprint for how fear could be manufactured, how belief could be turned into a weapon. And the men who orchestrated it did not fear exposure, because by the time anyone questioned the truth, the panic had already served its purpose. Fear is not chaos. Fear is currency. And in the 1890s, the men of the circle were rich beyond measure. But wealth was never their final hunger. Control was. Not over land, not over factories, over thought, over the way a man sees the world, the way he prays, the way he obeys. The witch panic in Danvers was not entertainment. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that belief could still be weaponized, even in an age of steam engines and telegrams. And the lesson was clear. When people fear the unseen, they will surrender to the seen, to the institutions, to the voices that promise safety. So what came next was inevitable. The circles expanded. They built networks inside lodges, inside universities, inside state politics. Men in black robes by day, men in black suits by night, tying ritual to policy and policy to ritual. But fear alone is not enough. Fear needs structure. It needs a doctrine, a set of rules that make obedience feel like choice. And so the circles borrowed from everything they could find, from Puritan severity, from Catholic hierarchy, from the esoteric orders of Europe. They stitched together a system of control, half science, half sorcery, and they called it progress. Because if you name it progress, people will kneel without realizing they are kneeling. And while they kneel, the world is rewritten. Behind the closed doors of those velvet parlors, decisions were made about schools, about newspapers, about what truths the public could handle and what truths would destroy them. And Salem, the place Americans laughed about as a relic of superstition, became the laboratory for a new kind of governance. Not by law, not by faith, but by fear itself. The devil's playground was no longer the gallows hill. It was the mind, and the men who ruled it were untouchable. By 1893, the panic in Danvers had faded. The newspapers moved on. The public thought it was over, but the circle didn't stop. They were just beginning. That year, a private meeting took place in Boston. In the back room of a law office near Beacon Hill, 10 men, no minutes recorded, no photographs taken, but one letter survived, locked in an archive for nearly a century. The letter speaks of opportunity, of a nation ripe for restructuring, and it names the instrument that would make it possible, not a church, not a military, but a new kind of institution, one that hides behind kindness, behind the language of health and progress. The asylum. In that smoke-filled room, they decided to pour money into psychiatric hospitals, not to cure, but to study, to measure how far the human mind could bend before it breaks. And this is where it gets darker. Some of the men in that room were not doctors. They were senators, industrialists, newspaper owners, men who could turn policy into law, opinion into dogma, and they agreed on a plan to build facilities across the country to collect the troubled, the hysterical, the unfit, and lock them away in the name of treatment. But inside those stone walls, the real experiments began. Isolation, hypnosis, induced hysteria, conditioning through fear and reward. Every trick the circles perfected in their parlors, now scaled to an industrial level, with government funding and Salem. Salem was the model, the name they never spoke aloud in meetings, but always kept in mind, because what they learned in those candlelit rooms was that fear is the most obedient servant, and once you own it, you own everything. This wasn't folklore anymore. This wasn't whispers in the dark. This was policy, disguised as mercy, and it would spread like a stain through every state in the Union. They told you witches burned for power. They told you women were chained for rebellion. But that's not the whole story. What if I told you that some women were not dragged into the fire? They stepped into it willingly, not as victims, but as architects of a new order. This wasn't about spells and potions. It was about leverage, about turning fear into currency. And the men who feared them the most were the ones who secretly gave them their script. The Salem myth didn't die in the 1600s. It was resurrected, refined, and repurposed, because the same elite hands that built secret brotherhoods knew something dangerous. They knew that feminine mystique could bend the world in ways brute force never could. And so they began to whisper. They fed women fragments of forbidden knowledge, pieces of ritual, symbols dressed as empowerment. But every secret had a leash. Every promise came with a price. Soon, you had circles of women practicing rites in shadow, believing they were reclaiming power, while the architects smiled, because they weren't breaking the system, they were reinforcing it. Here's the part that chills the blood. The same men who wrote laws against witchcraft funded salons for spiritualist women in the 1800s. They turned seance tables into recruitment tools, mediums into gatekeepers, and every candlelit ritual, every trance in a parlor room, was another chain disguised as liberation. This wasn't feminism. It was architecture, a design hidden in plain sight, where rebellion became another layer of control. So the next time you hear about witches reclaiming power, ask yourself, whose script are they reading from? Because real power never needed a seance. And the ones who sold mysticism as freedom were the same ones pulling strings behind the veil. This is the birth of a machine, and its first gears were women who thought they were breaking chains, but only forged new ones. They called them circles, because the word felt harmless, even sacred. Women gathered in basements, parlors, abandoned schoolhouses, hidden from the men who thought they still ruled them. They weren't chanting spells the way the newspapers wanted you to believe. No, this wasn't witchcraft in the storybook sense. It was a transfer of control, a quiet revolution, masked as mysticism. The first initiation didn't require fire or blood. It required loyalty. The oath was simple. Speak nothing, show nothing, hide everything. And in exchange, they promised something intoxicating. Freedom from the roles that chained them. Freedom from being property. And in that promise was the hook. Because the same elite men who had broken them now whispered that freedom into their ears. The women believed they were reclaiming power. They believed they were breaking out of a system built to keep them small. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that they were still inside the cage. The bars had just been painted gold. Every meeting had structure, symbols drawn in chalk, candles arranged in spirals, words repeated like mantras. But those symbols weren't ancient. Those words weren't born in secrecy. They were fed to them by the same forces that had resurrected the Salem myth. This wasn't rebellion. It was redesign, because the elite understood something brutal about human nature. When you can't stop someone from seeking power, you redirect them. You give them the illusion of choice while you pull the strings. And these circles became a perfect test. Could they engineer a gendered hierarchy inside a hierarchy? Could they weaponize pain, fear, and the thirst for equality into something they could monetize and control? The answer would echo for decades, through suffrage, through spiritualist movements, through the so-called awakening of the feminine. But here, in these first gatherings, it looked like liberation. It felt like rebellion, and that's how the trap works. You don't chain someone to the floor. You convince them the walls are protection, and the door is open, and they will stay, believing they've won. But the elite weren't done. They were about to bind this new order to something even darker, a ritual that made loyalty irreversible, a ritual that would turn empowerment into obedience forever. And it began with one simple object, a ring. The torches were already lit when they dragged him in. 6 figures stood around the pit, faces masked, robes brushing the dirt floor, like whispers of old ghosts. Each one silent, their movements slow and deliberate, not one word spoken. But the rhythm of the room had changed. It pulsed now, thick and primal, like a second heartbeat. In the center of the circle lay the table, wood-stained dark from decades of ceremonies no one spoke about, chains coiled on top like waiting serpents, cold iron glinting under the trembling light. They forced him down, flesh hitting the wood with a hollow crack, the sound carried like a death knell. They didn't strike him, didn't curse or scream, because this wasn't punishment. It was something worse. It was tradition. Hands pinned his arms wide, leather straps biting into wrists, until bone pressed against skin. He tried to speak, to plead, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It broke halfway through like it had been stolen from him. The leader stepped forward. You could tell without seeing the face. The weight of him shifted the air. He carried no blade, only a small black book. Its pages swollen and yellow with age, its cover slick with something that shimmered like oil. Every mark on it carved by a hand that hadn't lived in 100 years. The chanting began low, almost a hum at first, like bees crawling under your skin. It wasn't English, wasn't any language a sane man could hold in his head. And yet, it sounded alive. It crawled out of their throats and slithered into the dark. He thrashed, fought until the veins in his neck stood like ropes. But it didn't matter, because the chains weren't what held him. The words were, and as the first drop of wax burned into his chest, the realization hit like a blade. This wasn't about death. It was about belonging. They weren't killing him. They were claiming him. The day of reckoning began without fanfare. No drums, no chants, no obvious storm of madness. Just a quiet procession moving through the marble hallways, their bare feet whispering against the polished floor. Hands bound behind their backs, heads lowered, as if in prayer. But prayer would not save them now. The chosen were led through the east wing past rooms that smelled of blood and incense, past doors carved with symbols no patient had ever seen before, past wards where the unlucky still clawed at iron bars, unaware of what waited beyond. The air grew heavy, so heavy it clung to the lungs like wet cloth. Every breath tasted of smoke and something older, something sweet rotting beneath the sweetness, a perfume of decay and devotion. At the heart of the east wing stood a door that had no right to exist. Thick oak, iron hinges black with age, carved with lines that curved and spiraled like veins, and in the center burned a single word etched so deep the wood bled dark resin. The word was in a tongue no one spoke anymore, but every man understood what it meant. Threshold. The order paused here, not from fear but reverence, because what lay beyond was not a room. It was the mouth of the thing they served. 2 attendants approached, faces veiled, hands steady as they unlatched the locks. One by one, each bar falling with the weight of centuries. The sound echoed like bones breaking. When the final lock gave way, the door drifted inward, not opened, drifted, as though something behind it had inhaled and pulled the world closer. And there it was, a chamber that should not have existed, circular walls lined in obsidian plates, so polished they reflected every soul in fragments. Candles burned in black iron holders, each flame unnaturally still, and in the center a circle, drawn in ash so black it seemed to drink the light. This was no therapy, no treatment. This was theater for something older than man. Something, too, had demanded witness and blood. The chosen were placed inside the circle. Their heads bowed, their lips moving without sound, and the attendants began to hum, low, slow, vibrating the marrow itself. Whatever would happen next was not healing. It was offering. And the institution had waited decades for this night. They heard it before they saw it. The voice, low and steady, threading through the damp air. It wasn't singing exactly. It was something older, something stripped of comfort, a tone that felt carved from stone. Victor froze. For a second, his bravado cracked, because the voice didn't sound human. It sounded like the earth itself was humming, dragging its breath up from the bedrock, and feeding it through the throat of a man. Samuel motioned for silence. His lantern glow cut jagged shadows across the brick wall. They edged forward until the room opened up. And there it was, a circle of men, cloaked in black, their heads bowed. The glow of oil lamps pooled around them, casting long black spines across the floor. In the center lay a slab of marble, not a table, not an altar, something between both, polished, veined, cold, and on it, a boy no older than 8, his chest barely rising, his eyes open but empty, not dead, not awake, something in between. Victor stumbled back. The lantern rattled in his hand. One of the men looked up, just the tilt of his chin, slow and deliberate, and the humming stopped. The silence hit like a blade, heavy, sharp, cutting all thought from the air. Samuel's breath hissed between his teeth. He reached for the revolver at his belt. But then the man stepped forward. The cloak slipped back from his shoulders, and Samuel saw the pin glinting on his lapel. A simple symbol, a circle enclosing a cross, carved deep in gold, the mark he had seen in the ledgers, in the reports. The mark that never made sense, until now. The man smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was a smile that said, "You were always meant to find this, and you were always meant to understand that you will never leave." The boy on the slab blinked, slow, mechanical, like a puppet with strings drawn tight, and Samuel finally understood what the cold water was for. Not healing, not cleansing, but washing something out, making space for something else. Behind them, the door closed with a whisper, the kind that feels like a hand sliding across your throat. The candle flames swayed as if breathing. The room smelled of sweat and something metallic, a scent that clung to the back of the throat. The men stood shoulder to shoulder, their shadows merging on the walls, eyes fixed on the floor where the circle had been drawn in chalk, white lines that pulsed in the glow of the fire, like veins feeding a living thing. No one spoke, not a cough, not a breath louder than a whisper. Silence pressed down like a hand on the chest. They were listening, waiting for the sound they all feared yet craved. The preacher's voice finally cut through, low, steady, almost tender, not like a sermon, not like prayer, something older than both. He spoke words that didn't belong to this soil, syllables that cracked like dry wood underfoot. And with each one, the air thickened. It clung to the skin, to the lungs, making every inhale feel like swallowing smoke. Then came the knife. It gleamed when the firelight kissed its edge. Long, curved, hungry, the preacher held it high. And in that instant, the room seemed smaller, walls closing in, ceiling bowing down, as if the house itself wanted to kneel. He didn't rush. He pressed the blade against his own palm first, drew a slow line until the skin parted. Blood welled up thick and dark, dripping onto the chalk. The first drop sizzled, a sound too soft to be real, but they all heard it, and they knew what it meant. This was the offering, the opening, the line between them, and it had just thinned to nothing. What was inside that circle was no longer paint, no longer dust. It was alive, and it was watching. They believed the doors were locked to keep danger out, but in truth, the danger was already inside, because the men running the ritual were no longer bound by science. They were bound by something older, something buried deep beneath polite society's rules, an oath that demanded control at any cost. One by one, the subjects were led down the corridor, feet bare against cold tile, each step echoing like a countdown to something unspeakable. No one screamed, not because they weren't afraid, but because fear had already hollowed them out. They were past the point of resistance. They were clay waiting to be shaped, and the doctors, those men in white coats, had become sculptors of the mind. What they carried in their hands wasn't medical equipment, not anymore. It was ritualistic. Sharp metal instruments engraved with symbols, vials of liquid with no labels, and a bowl of something thick and dark that glistened under the dim light. They called it preparation. But there was nothing clinical about it. Every motion was deliberate, measured, almost sacred, as if they weren't just conducting an experiment. They were invoking a covenant, and at the heart of it, the belief that breaking a child was the purest way to unlock the human psyche. Because a shattered mind can be rebuilt into anything you desire. An assassin, a prophet, a weapon that smiles when it kills. This was no longer research. This was alchemy of flesh and thought, a transmutation of innocence into power. And the children, they weren't just victims, they were offerings. Because the men in that room didn't serve medicine, they served the order that had no name, the one that fed on secrecy and thrived on silence. And tonight, that order was hungry. The circle tightens. Not a word is spoken, not yet. The air feels heavy, like something pressing down on your chest, like the room itself is holding its breath. At the center sits the book. Black leather cracked with age, edges frayed like it has outlived centuries. It is not scripture, not holy in any way you understand. The pages inside are carved with symbols and names no one was ever meant to speak aloud. One by one they kneel before it, each man lowering his head, each man laying his hand on the cover, the skin of the book cold as stone. The keeper speaks first. His voice is low, gravel dragged across metal. Repeat after me, he says. And they do. I swear to silence. I swear to secrecy. I swear to the order that binds us. Each word lands heavy, like a chain around the throat, like a lock snapping shut. When the last man speaks, the keeper draws the blade, silver glint in the candlelight. He slices his palm slow, lets the blood drip into a shallow dish. Then he passes the blade. One by one they do the same. Blood pooling dark and thick. The smell of iron rising. The air sharp with it. The oath is sealed in blood, and for a moment, no one moves. No one breathes. Only the sound of wax hissing and the steady drip of red on wood. Then the keeper looks up, his eyes catching the light. It begins now, he says. This is only the first step. The circle was sealed. There was no turning back now. Inside the chamber, shadows pulsed like living things as the hooded men raised their hands in unison and began to chant in that language of ash and stone. A sound so deep it seemed to press against the bones, vibrating the marrow, making the teeth ache. It was not words you could understand. It was older than meaning, older than scripture. The syllables bent the air, warping the silence until the room itself seemed to twist in protest. The walls bled condensation, sweat dripped from the low ceiling and ran down the cracks like veins opening in plaster. The smell of iron grew stronger, like blood warming in the sun, and under that, the faint sweetness of decay that had no business being there unless someone was rotting behind those walls. At the center of the circle, the chair waited, its wood blackened with age, its arms scarred with deep grooves, as though clawed by desperate fingernails long ago. Straps hung loose and ready, not leather belts, not rope, but something braided from human hair, tightly woven, strands glistening under candlelight, proof that this was not the first time the ritual had tasted flesh. The leader raised a book bound in hide that had darkened with oils of hands long dead, and in that voice, sharpened by zeal and sickness, he spoke words that every man in that room had sworn never to repeat outside these walls. A prayer, but not for mercy, not for salvation, for dominion, for power, for the right to hold the soul of another human being like a coin pressed between fingers and decide whether to spend it or break it. The chanting grew louder. The walls seemed to hum like a hive alive with insects. Then the book slammed shut with a crack that sounded like bone snapping, and the leader whispered 4 words that turned every breath in the room to ice. Bring the subject forward. The others obeyed without question, because once the circle was closed, obedience was no longer a choice. The woods are no longer silent. Every tree seems to whisper. Every branch seems to lean in, as if listening to something ancient and cruel. You move deeper into the clearing, where the smell of pine gives way to something else, something metallic, something like blood. And then you see it. A circle, carved into the earth with an obsessive precision. The lines are deep, raw, and fresh, like the ground itself had been wounded. Inside the circle, patterns spiral outwards, looping into symbols that defy logic. Some look like letters, but from no language you've ever seen. Others twist into forms that resemble bones, jaws, and coiling spines. It's not random. It's deliberate and old. The frost hasn't touched it. The snow bends around it. Like the earth itself, refuses to cover what's been marked here. And there's more. Objects placed at perfect intervals along the perimeter. Charred bones, not animal bones. These are too small. A doll with its eyes stitched shut. A jar of something black and thick, frozen at the edges. You can almost feel the heat that once burned here. The echo of fire. The whisper of voices that called something through. And then you notice the trees. They aren't random either. Every trunk is scarred with the same mark, an X cut deep into the bark, and below it, a name. Names you don't recognize. Names carved with a trembling hand. And every X drips with something that isn't sap. You take a step back, and that's when you hear it. A sound so faint, it feels like it crawls inside your skull instead of your ears. Not words, not yet. Just a hum, a vibration, a low, steady tone that comes from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then the thought hits you, the one that won't leave. This isn't a place where something happened. This is a place where something is waiting, and you just stepped inside its circle. The ground shakes again, harder this time. The vibration crawls up his legs, into his chest, like a drum pounding inside his ribs. He stumbles forward. The trees behind him sway as if pushed by a hand, not wind, something heavier, something alive. Then the sound starts, low at first, a hum rolling under the earth, deep and ancient, like a choir of voices buried for centuries. They are not singing, they are calling, and every syllable feels wrong, like words that should never be spoken by human tongues. The boy presses his hands to his ears, but it does not stop. The sound is inside him now, behind his eyes, in his teeth. It vibrates through his bones, like a swarm of bees. He drops to his knees. The leaves under him are warm, not from sunlight, but from something breathing below the soil. He jerks his hands back and sees steam curling up between his fingers. Then the trees open into a clearing, and there it is, a circle of stones blackened by fire, symbols etched deep into their surfaces, lines that twist and coil like living serpents, and in the center, a slab of granite slick with something dark. It glistens like oil. But he knows it is not oil. It smells metallic, sweet and rotten at the same time. Around the slab, shapes crouch low to the earth. Figures wrapped in hides that still have bone attached, antlers rising from their heads like crowns. Their bodies bend and sway as one, slow, hypnotic, moving to a rhythm he cannot hear with his ears. Only feel in the marrow of his bones. One of them stops and looks at him. The mask turns, and for a moment, he thinks it is not a mask at all, but a face stretched too thin over something else, something that does not belong in this world. His stomach knots, his throat locks, and still, he cannot move. The figure raises a hand, long fingers ending in blackened tips. It crooks one finger toward him, a single gesture, commanding him closer. And that is when he sees what rests on the stone slab, and everything inside him shatters. Dawn breaks like a reluctant witness. Its light crawls across the sanatorium floor, revealing more than daylight should. The marble tiles still gleam faintly from the last wash, but something remains beneath the sheen, something that resists scrubbing and fire and silence, a residue of screams, a memory soaked into every pore. Nurse Albright moves through the ward like a ghost. Her shoes barely touch the ground, but every step is deliberate, measured, almost reverent. She carries a basin of water that isn't for drinking. It's too cold for that. This water is for something else, something older than medicine and more brutal than punishment. The cold water cure is ready again, and then she stops, because she hears it, the sound from room 6. It's faint, like a whisper behind a wall, like someone confessing into stone. The room is empty now. The patient was gone 3 days ago. But the sound lingers, soft sobbing or maybe laughter. With this place, you can't tell the difference anymore. She steps inside and sets the basin down. The air feels heavier here, as if time itself has thickened. The straps on the bed are loose now, but the indentations on the mattress tell the truth. Someone fought here, someone begged, and no one listened. On the nightstand is a photograph, half burned at the edges, a little girl with a ribbon in her hair. Someone had hidden it under the pillow. Someone who didn't want to forget who they were before the cure made them unrecognizable. Albright touches the photo, and for a moment, she feels something strange, regret, or maybe fear, because she knows what the next round will bring, the next immersion, the next forced silence under ice water that steals breath faster than prayer. She picks up the basin, but her hands are trembling now, because she knows the cure isn't curing anything. It's breaking people apart and drowning what's left. And if she keeps carrying the water, one day it won't just be their screams she hears in the walls. It will be her own. The hallways are quiet, but the silence is thick. It presses against your chest. Every step you take echoes too loud. The patients lie still, some asleep, some pretending, some broken beyond recognition. The floors are slick with water, cold from the baths, cold enough to steal your breath before fear even reaches it. Dr. Kellogg moves between the beds, his hands steady, his eyes empty. He does not look at the faces. He does not see the bodies. He sees only the experiment, the pattern, the control. The attendants follow like shadows. They know better than to flinch. They know better than to ask questions. Every twitch or stammer would be noted, every hesitation punished. The water treatment begins. The first girl is lifted. Her body trembles. She is screaming silently, her mouth open. No sound comes, only her chest rising and falling faster than her heartbeat. Kellogg pours the water over her. It is ice. It is fire. It robs her of balance and will. And when she collapses, eyes glassy, limbs shaking, the attendants hold her down, because resistance is the first thing that must be broken. Then the next, and the next. The room becomes a rhythm of cries and splashes, of bodies pressing against wood and tile. The air grows heavy with the smell of wet hair, the tang of iron, the taste of fear. Through it all, Kellogg watches and smiles slightly. Not a kind smile, not relief, a calculation, a power refined, each mind bent, each scream accounted for, each body catalogued, and you realize, this is not medicine. This is architecture. The architecture of control. The shaping of men and women into forms they did not choose. The making of obedient vessels. And if you were to survive this night, you would never be the same. Your mind would carry the shape of the sanatorium. Your memory would echo with the rhythm of the cold water and the silent screams. And the world outside would never know. The whispers reach the streets, not from newspapers, not from lectures, but from those who lived, from those who carried the scars, from those who could not speak without trembling. A mother tells the story of her daughter. Her voice shakes like dry leaves. She speaks of cold water, of straps that cut into flesh, of silent screams that echoed through the night. Neighbors listen. Some nod, some turn away. No one wants to imagine the horrors. The journalists arrive. They step into the halls, eyes wide, not knowing whether to be horrified or sickened by fascination. They see the records, charts of human suffering dressed in numbers and neat handwriting. The baths, the fasts, the experiments catalogued as progress. And they begin to write. The words escape into the world. Slowly at first, then faster, like a flood breaching a dam. They cannot be stopped. The public reads. The public gasps. The public demands answers. But Kellogg does not panic. He does not blink. He only tightens control. He knows power is not given, it is taken. And even in exposure, he intends to hold it. Inside the walls, the patients feel it. The rhythm of fear has changed. The observers are watching. But that changes nothing. The baths continue. The restraints tighten. The cold water pours. Bodies shiver. Spines bend, eyes glass over with silent surrender. Outside the world debates, but inside the real work continues. A lesson in obedience, a study in breaking will. Each scream, each shiver, each tear. It is data, it is proof, it is power manifest. And in the shadows, some whisper to each other. The system can be resisted. The system can be broken. But at what cost? Because once the circle is closed, once the cold water flows, once the screams echo through tile and corridor, you are no longer free. You are the machine's property, and every night it waits for the next one. The night stretches long and heavy. The lamps flicker, casting shadows that crawl across the walls like living things. Kellogg moves through the halls. A conductor of fear, every patient, a note in his symphony, every shiver, every gasp, every trembling hand, measured, recorded, used. The new wing lies below, a place the world will never see, a chamber carved from stone, walls slick with moisture, floor cold enough to bite through flesh, straps waiting, baths filled with ice water. And in the center, a platform elevated like an altar, waiting for the next sacrifice. He calls the attendants, their faces pale, hands steady. He instructs them, slowly, deliberately, no words wasted, every movement precise, every step rehearsed like a ritual. Because in this place, medicine is theater, and fear is the script. The first patient is brought down, eyes wide, mouth open, but no sound escapes. The attendants place her on the platform. Straps bite into her arms and legs. Her chest rises faster than her breath. And still, no one flinches. No one hesitates. Kellogg pours the water, ice and fire mingling over trembling flesh. The girl's body arches. Her fingers clutch the air, but the attendants hold firm. Her eyes glass over. Not from death, not yet. From the slow erosion of will, from the teaching that resistance is futile. The second patient arrives. Then the third. The pattern grows. A rhythm of terror, a pulse of control that reverberates through stone and bone. And in that chamber, something awakens, a dark current that courses beneath the floor, through the walls, into the minds of all present. It feeds on fear. It grows stronger with every scream, every shiver, every hollowed look of submission. Outside the chamber, the world debates and wonders. What is justice? What is progress? But inside, the ritual continues. The cold water pours, the straps tighten, the lights flicker, and the patients are molded, broken, shaped, into something that no one outside could recognize as human. And you realize, this is not healing. This is a crucible. This is power distilled into flesh, a demonstration of what control can do. And once you witness it, you cannot unsee, you cannot undo. You are changed, marked by the rhythm of fear, marked by the lesson of obedience. The night is alive with whispers. They curl around your ears, soft at first, then sharp, like knives drawn from the dark. The platform waits, cold and merciless. The straps gleam under the dim lamps. The water pours slowly. But it is enough. Enough to steal breath. Enough to twist limbs. Enough to teach obedience in the language of pain. The attendants move like shadows. Silent, precise, relentless. Every motion measured, every face blank. Because if fear touches them, it becomes theirs. And no one survives fear here, intact. Kellogg stands above the platform, a god in his own creation. He watches the body writhe, the eyes glaze, the muscles tighten, and with each trembling gasp, he notes the exact moment, the exact degree, the exact point where resistance dies. The chamber vibrates with it. Not sound, not air, not floorboards, but something older, something hungry, something that sees the fear and consumes it, and you feel it too. A pull in your chest, a tightening around your ribs, as if the very air is teaching submission. He calls the next patient forward, each one smaller than the last, each one more afraid. The water hits, and screams fill the chamber, but they are muffled, trapped under ice and discipline. You watch them struggle, and know that the lesson is cruel and permanent. Outside the stone walls, the world debates morality, but inside, there is no debate. There is only ritual. There is only rhythm. There is only obedience earned in terror. The keeper watches from the shadows, not intervening, not needing to, because by now the lesson has begun to take root. The cold has seeped into minds. The straps have marked flesh, and every scream has built a bridge, from the living to something else, something ancient and patient, waiting for the perfect moment. The final gasp of the last patient echoes, and silence follows. Heavy, thick, like the world itself is holding its breath. You realize this is the true power of the Rees to all. Not the water, not the straps, not even Kellogg, but the fear, the obedience, the total surrender of body and mind. And in that silence you understand the lesson is complete and the next cycle will begin. Because in this place, nothing dies, nothing ends. Fear simply waits for the next hand to open, for the next body to tremble, and for the ritual to continue. The candles flicker, the shadows grow long, the room stretches and contracts, breathing with the fear it holds. Kellogg moves among the bodies, checking pulse, checking breath, checking obedience. Each patient is a study, each gasp a data point, each shiver a confirmation of control. He stops at the center, the platform empty now, but the memory of the last body lingers, heavy in the air, thick enough to taste. The attendants stand silent, their faces masks, their hands steady. They have learned to carry the terror without being consumed, but they feel it. The current beneath the floor, the hunger in the walls, the dark rhythm pulsing through the room. It whispers to them, and they obey without question. Kellogg lifts his hand. The room stills. Even the air seems to pause. He speaks, not loudly, not to command, but to mark the moment, to carve it into the minds of all present. This is not a mistake. This is not cruelty. This is necessary. The fear, the obedience, the surrender. It is the only language the world understands. A shiver runs through the floor, through the walls, through the bodies, and you feel it, deep in your chest, pulling at your ribs, twisting your thoughts, showing you what it means to be broken and remade. The next patient is brought forward, a small boy, no more than 12, eyes wide, hands shaking. He sees the platform, sees the straps, sees the cold water, and he knows before anyone speaks that resistance is futile. The water hits, and his breath is stolen. His body arches, his limbs flail, but the attendants hold firm, because fear has a teacher, and this room is its classroom. The chanting begins low, almost imperceptible, a hum under the walls, a rhythm older than memory. It coils around the platform, around the straps, around every heart beating with terror. And you understand, this is not about survival. This is about transformation. The ritual will not kill. It will not heal. It will make you something something that obeys, something that remembers, something that carries the lesson forward, and the next cycle begins again. Because in this place, fear does not end. It only waits. The final chamber lies ahead. You can feel it before you see it, a pressure in the air, a darkness that moves with purpose. It waits. The attendants guide the last of the patients forward, their faces pale, their hands trembling, not with fear anymore, but with the understanding that this is inevitability incarnate. Kellogg stands above the platform, a silent god, every eye in the room fixed on him. The candles burn lower, their flames bending toward the center, as if drawn by some unseen gravity. The ritual begins again. The straps secure the body. The water pours, cold enough to steal thought. But that is not the lesson. The lesson is deeper. It is beneath the skin, inside the mind, inside the marrow. The surrender of control, the breaking of the self. A low hum vibrates through the floor, through the walls, through every nerve. It coils around your thoughts, tightens your chest, makes your hands shake, makes your breath shallow, and you understand. This is what they were shaping. Not bodies, not minds, souls. The keeper steps from the shadows. He moves slowly, deliberately, every step measured, every motion ritualized. He whispers something no one else can hear, a promise or a curse, and the air responds. The final patient thrashes, a small body under the weight of cold and fear. But the attendants hold firm, because obedience must be absolute, every struggle a lesson, every gasp an instruction, and then the hum sharpens, becomes a chorus. The room itself sings with the rhythm of surrender, and the patient stills. Not because they are free, not because they are safe, but because they have understood. The ritual has claimed them. The ritual has marked them. They are changed, and so is everyone who witnesses it. Kellogg steps back, eyes gleaming, the room heavy with the silence of submission, and you realize this is not an ending. It is a perpetuation, a cycle, a machine built from fear, from control, from human obedience twisted into ritual, and once you have seen it, you cannot forget it. You cannot escape it. The lesson follows you, always. The candles gutter low, the shadows stretch long, and the chamber exhales a weight that presses against your chest, heavy, relentless, impossible to ignore. Kellogg stands alone now, his eyes dark with calculation. The ritual is complete, but the lesson endures. It does not sleep. It does not forgive. It waits. The bodies lie still, but they are not empty. They carry the rhythm, the cold, the obedience, the imprint of fear that will follow them forever. Every shiver, every gasp, every silent scream, a mark etched into the soul. You look around and you understand. This is not a place of healing. This is not a place of mercy. This is a crucible, a proving ground, a place where power is distilled into flesh, where the weak are made to bend, and the strong are remade in fear's image. Outside the walls, the world moves on, unaware, unwilling to see. The whispers fade. The newspapers forget. The victims disappear into history. But the machine continues, silently, patiently, waiting for the next hand to open, the next body to tremble, the next soul to be claimed. And you realize you have witnessed something forbidden, something dangerous, a truth no one should ever know. Because once it touches you, once you see the rhythm of control, once you feel the weight of obedience, you cannot unsee it. You cannot walk away unchanged. The chamber empties, the straps hang loose, the water pools cold and still. But the lesson remains, lingering in the air, in your bones, in your mind. And when you step out into the night, into the world that believes itself safe, you carry it with you, a shadow, a pulse, a reminder that power does not need permission. It only needs fear. It only needs obedience. And the ritual continues always, because some lessons are eternal.